reports now from Colonel Richard Kemp, who commanded British forces in Afghanistan, but also chaired the intelligence group of the government's Cobra Emergency Committee and put together intelligence for Cobra and for the Prime Minister. Richard Kemp, thanks very much for being with us. I wonder if you'd just like to give us your perspective on the attacks here in Paris and the implications of those attacks for British intelligence and I suppose for security services across Europe.
I think those attacks were, sadly to say, inevitable, and this is not hindsight. Many people predicted, obviously not by exact time and place, but did predict attacks in France and elsewhere in Europe, because of course the Islamic State has declared war on our countries. In terms of the way that the intelligence services operate, I think it's easy to criticise, and no doubt a number of errors will come to light, some already are. But it's a really tough job for the French intelligence service, as it is for ours here in the UK. There are so many targets. I mean, the head of MI5 recently said there are about 3,000 people in the UK who are on suspicion of being jihadists involved in terrorist activity in some way. And I'm sure that the number in France is even higher. So they have to prioritise. They have to think very carefully, make careful judgments about who they monitor, who they don't. And as we can see from this attack and from other attacks that have taken place in Europe, the judgment's not always right. Intelligence is far from an exact science. And I think elsewhere in Europe, there will be a great deal of work going on now because, of course, there are still, as you've been discussing, there are still terrorists apparently on the loose who are involved in this. Who knows what they're planning? There have been, in the past, there have been attacks which have been conducted in waves and series. And so it may be in France and maybe attacks planned for elsewhere. And the intelligence services will be working closely together throughout Europe and, of course, other countries in the Middle East and America to try and nail this and try and do what they can to stop further attacks taking place.
And as I mentioned, you worked with Cobra on the intelligence group there. What's your sense of what British intelligence will be trying to find out now about these attacks? And we heard also from Number 10 that there have been a number of attacks very recently in Britain that have been foiled by British intelligence.
Well, clearly first of all, I'd say our intelligence services have been phenomenally effective against terrorism in the UK. And although we have had some terrorist attacks, 7/7, of course, the attempts to blow up a nightclub in London, the attempt to blow up Glasgow Airport, and the cutting to pieces of Lee Rigby in Woolwich, and others. But most of the attacks that have been planned for the UK have been foiled by MI5 and the police, and they have been resulted in some cases in many jihadists being behind bars today. But in terms of what they'll be doing now, the first and overriding priority, of course, for our intelligence services and police is to protect this country and to ensure that if there's any connection, perhaps any possibility of a planned series of attacks linked to the Paris attack, or indeed copycat attacks from Paris, which is possible, that all possible steps are made, all intelligence is carefully reviewed to see if there's any indication of that. Secondly, of course, they will be doing everything they can to try and help France. And there's a very close intelligence relationship. I enjoyed a very close intelligence relationship with my counterpart in Paris, as the intelligence services do today. And they will be working hard, exchanging intelligence and trying to help the French. And then, of course, there's the kind of secondary aspects, both important, of collecting information that could be useful to prosecute those involved who are not dead, and looking at targeting intelligence to enable French and other strikes at the Islamic State in retaliation, and also as a preventative action to prevent them from directing further attacks against us.
Colonel Richard Kemp, thank you so much for your time. Colonel Richard Kemp there, who was chairing the intelligence group of the Cobra Government Emergency Committee.